Watchmen is a comic about comics. Its content is filled with fictional and real comics history. Its fictional memoir, for example, Hollis Mason's Under the Hood, tells how the reading of the original Action Comics #1 inspired Mason to become a superhero. Watchmen contains, too, The Black Freighter, a fictional comic book interwoven into its story, but with a detailed history of production involving the real company, EC. It allegorizes comic history within it and experiments with the possibilities of the comic form. In this lecture, I break down how Watchmen's allegory for comics works in two ways to argue that Watchmen pushes comics so deeply into their formal structure and their history that it becomes indistinguishable from poetry, indeed achieves the qualities of poetry in a very real sense. Like Planetary, the plot of Watchmen works through an allegory, staging a progression from a superhero team known as the Minutemen to a second, more gritty crew known as the Crime Busters. The plot revolves around the Keene Act in 1977, which regulates these heroes just as the Comics Code Authority did after 1954. Its tale of the Black Freighter even includes a photo of the actual comic book artist Joe Orlando as the artist of the Black Freighter, seen here in real life at the door to Bill Gaines' actual office at EC Comics. After the comics crash, Orlando became an editor for DC. Alan Moore approached him to draw a splash page for the prose ending of Chapter 5, the fictional reprint from Chapter 5 of the Treasure Island Treasury of Comics, which Orlando did and which was embedded as an element of the page. Thus, Watchmen tells a story of the very history we have studied over this course, and in its movement from the Minutemen to the Crime Busters, in its notion of the Keene Act and its incorporation of EC Comics, we can see an allegory for the progression from the Golden Age to the Silver Age. Moore originally proposed the Watchmen story to DC as using a group of heroes that DC had just purchased from Charlton Comics. John Santiago and Ed Levy founded Charlton Comics in 1940, actually naming it in 1944. Charlton's first comic was the 1944 Yellow Jacket, anthology of horror and superhero materials. Charlton developed a unique in-house production method in which everything was done at one location in Derby, Connecticut. They paid less, but paid salary wages as opposed to work for hire, and major comic artists such as Steve Ditko, who co-created Spider-Man with Stan Lee at Marvel, and Jerry Siegel, who co-created Superman, eventually worked for Charlton. The Charlton line of superheroes was a mixture of in-house creations and properties acquired from other companies. By the mid-1950s, Charlton's portfolio was heavy in horror titles, and so it had to diversify after the Comics Code went into effect. In 1955, it bought The Blue Beetle from Fox Comics. This was a story of a rookie police officer who fought neighborhood crime in his costume. During the Silver Age, Charlton introduced a string of its own heroes. Joe Gill and Ditko created Captain Atom in 1960, and in 1966, Nightshade, also a Gill and Ditko hero, appeared in his title. The two heroes had a brief relationship. Thunderbolt, a character whose powers was associated with Eastern philosophy, was created by Pete Morisi in 1966, and the Peacemaker, created by Gill and Pat Boyette, was a pacifist diplomat who dons a costume as a man who loves peace so much that he's willing to fight for it, seen here holding his pistol. The Peacemaker debuted the same year and got his own comic in 1967. Ditko created the mysterious Question in 1967. In 1983, Charlton was purchased by DC Comics. Moore's initial plan was to use the Charlton line of heroes in Watchmen, but DC editor Dick Giordano, realizing that these properties would either be killed or irreparably damaged by Moore, turned him down. As a result, the Watchmen heroes are revised versions of the Charlton line, and if we cast our eyes about the room, we can easily see the parallels. Nighthawk for the Blue Beetle, Dr. Manhattan for Captain Atom, Silk Spectre for Nightshade, the Comedian for the Peacemaker, and Rorschach for the Question. Some, such as the Comedian, are cross-cut with other heroes, such as Marvel's Nick Fury, here drawn in all his Cold War glory by the inimitable Steranko. The Watchmen heroes are thus deeply derivative. An accident of editorial control, this creates them as echoes of comics past, and thus implies an undertow of illusion in their very identities that not only harmonizes with Watchmen's allegory, but adds a layer of depth to its theme of perspective. For these are heroes who have been around a while. And if we do not know the history of Charlton Comics, do not know that the heroes' secret identities are not their names as civilians, but are, in fact, their roles as heroes of another publishing house, we lack perspective on the comic. Further, Moore tells that he only had material for 6 issues of adventure, but filled it out to a full 12 issues, so important to the ticking hand of the doomsday clock, the circular wheel that matches the Watchman smiley face, by creating the backstories for each character. Moore's brilliance in Watchmen, then, is to improvise an original story from the meat and gristle of the comics industry. In creating the characters, his contract stipulated that when DC did not use them for a year, the copyright would revert to Moore and Gibbons. Watchmen has never gone out of print, never fallen out of use, and thus famously, and somewhat painfully, Alan Moore never gained control of the characters he created. He has had to stand by, while DC went ahead with the Watchmen movie, and then developed the Before Watchmen line of comics, a series that fills out every possible aside, every dark alleyway within Watchmen, leaving almost nothing unexplored. While Dave Gibbons has signed off on these projects, Moore has not, and there is no little tragedy in such a state of affairs, for it casts Moore among the comics creators who have seen their work taken away from them, casts him with many of the greats, Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel, Bill Finger and Jack Kirby. At the same time, Watchmen is created around comics in content and form. All of Moore's greatest work is, in this sense, quite derivative. His V for Vendetta echoes George Orwell's 1984. From Hell is a detailed telling of Jack the Ripper. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen returns to the monstrous heroes of Victorian literature, and Lost Girls explores the sexuality of Alice from Alice in Wonderland, Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, and Wendy Darling from Peter Pan. Moore's originality, his greatness, springs from his derivative nature. That derivativeness and originality are not oppositional, but are paradoxically true and complementary, suggests how profoundly Watchmen exceeds the limits of the pre-existing formula of comics without destroying that formula. That Watchmen exceeds the limits of formula without destroying it is true for its page layout as well. For example, when we first meet Dr. Manhattan, a man transformed into a being able to manipulate matter on a subatomic level, able to see the world micro and macroscopically, the one true superhero of Watchmen, and thus possessing the perspective of a god. He is working on what he calls a supersymmetrical theory. This theory is realized not by Dr. Manhattan, but by Moore and Gibbons in Chapter 5, the chapter entitled Fearful Symmetry, and ending with a quotation from William Blake's poem, The Tiger. The chapter tells of Rorschach's capture by the police and of a botched assassination attempt on Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias. The assassination attempt is clearly symmetrical, and lying at the center of the issue, it splits it neatly in two, with Veidt's and the assassin's body completing the V in the background to an even more symmetrical X, and the 6 surrounding panels of the pages neatly balancing one another. If we look into the chapter, we find this splash page is not its only symmetrical quality. The first and the last pages are neatly balanced. The chapter begins with Rorschach walking through a puddle and entering Moloch's house, and it ends with Rorschach exiting the house and being dragged through the same puddle. If we flip through the pages, we see that the third page depicts Moloch descending a staircase and ambushed by Rorschach, who uses the cold refrigerator to surprise him. And the third from the last page shows the police ascending the staircase and ambushed by Rorschach, who uses hot fire. Page 6 shows us Rorschach's initial exit from Moloch's house, and the 6 from the last page shows us his return. They match panel for panel. Page 7 cuts to 2 police officers investigating a killing, and page 7 from the last shows us them again analyzing the details. Page 8 and 8 from the back are both scenes from the newsstand, where Bernie reads The Black Freighter and Bernard pontificates on the ills of the world. The one introduces the Black Freighter, the other concludes it. Pages 10 and 10 from the end deepen the relationship between Laurie and Dan. So it goes. The comic is perfectly symmetrical, panel for panel, grid after grid, page after page. It is super symmetrical, really, and interweaves its many stories. The Black Freighter comic book, the newsstand discussion, the police investigation, Laurie and Dan's romance, Veidt's attempted assassination, into the action of Rorschach and the police seamlessly. Very few readers perceive this supersymmetrical quality on the first or even the second time through. Indeed, for all of its ornate design, the chapter never appears stilted or clunky. Rather, it rolls along smoothly, thus its fearful symmetry is not simply its technical virtuosity, but the fact that its grand design easily goes unnoticed even though, upon reflection, it is quite obvious. Again, Watchmen is a poem of perspective, and if, in our perspective, we as readers have missed this symmetry, even when its title warns us of what lies ahead at the start, we are forced to ask, what else in life? What other patterns and symmetries do we also miss? This question organizes the chapter's title, which alludes to William Blake's poem, The Tiger. Let me read to you the poem as it appears in the 1794 copy of Songs of Innocence and of Experience. The Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what a mortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer? What the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil? What dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? Blake, pausing on the tiger's beautiful symmetry, asks, who is its maker, and what did he dare? Essentially, his question is the same as Moore's. From what perspective do we see the world? And given this world's powerful patterning, what is its creator's perspective? What is its creator's intention? Who watches the watchman? Blake was an artist and a printer as well as a poet, and these qualities are woven into his text. The poem is printed in relief etching. The image is hand-colored, and the text itself is overwritten with pen and ink. His poem, just like The Watchman, is not exclusively a meditation on world creation. It is also about the making of art. For, of course, looking at the actual tiger on the page, a wonderful tiger, and if we look at the different editions of this poem, we see each hand-colored tiger is somewhat different, filled with its own individuality and personality. And if we look at this page, and if we look at this tiger, we can understand that William Blake made the tiger, and that his poem is asking about the power of art. More, if we examine the page, admire the tiger's stripes and form, we can see that it too is nicely gridded out. The tree's branches separating out the stanzas into separate panels, each for its own contemplation. Indeed, stanza itself means stopping place or room, and that is exactly what these panels of poetry are. They are each a stopping place for reflection and examination and conclusion before we move on to the next set of propositions and tensions. The page is a poem, and that is as true for the comic book as it is for the book of poetry. Just as a poem is an arrangement of stanzas, the comic page is an arrangement of panels. Both rely on layout, the scheme, to make their meaning, and both collect individual pages into a greater trajectory, a book of poems or a narrative story. Poetry often appears intimidating to readers, in some way unapproachable. This is a trick of authority and initiation, and we might recall that comics have their own terms of intimidation, their own history and rules, and their own culture of initiation. Crossing these hurdles, we should understand that comic books and books of poetry are both approaches to the world ruled by the same set of poetics, trope, scheme, genre, and canon, and both are liberated by the same skills of interpretation, analysis, and synthesis. Both allow us to look at the world, to explore it, and reflect upon it. So I say that comics poetics are a true poetics, and give us greater perspective on the fearful symmetry of our world.